Welcome to the Physician's Guide to Doctoring, a practical guide for practicing physicians. Dr. Bradley Block interviews experts in and out of medicine to find out everything we should have been learning while we were memorizing Krebs cycle. The ideas expressed on this podcast are those of the interviewer and interviewee and do not represent those of their respective employers. And now, here's Dr. Bradley Block.
And now a word from this week's sponsor, Laurel Road.
Since I had my son, paying down my med school debt has become my top priority. I remember holding him in my arms for the first time, looking into his beautiful little face, and just wanting the best future for him. With the Laurel Road Student Loan Cashback Card, my regular purchases earn me 2% cashback when I use it to pay down my student loans, which helps me reach my goals faster and plan for my family's future.
Laurel Road for Doctors. Banking, insights, and benefits uniquely designed for doctors. See laurelroad.com/doctor checking for full terms and conditions. Laurel Road is a brand of KeyBank N.A. member FDIC.
Professor Timothy Caulfield, thanks so much for being on the podcast.
Brad, thanks for having me on.
So first question is a real zinger. Are birds real?
Obviously, they are not.
Yes.
This has become clear very recently that there is a government plot to replace the birds, and that plot has been successful. And so most of the birds that you now see flying around are actually cameras, and they're monitoring our behavior and our activities, and they're feeding it back to a central hub that allows them to make a whole host of nefarious plans. And Brad, unfortunately, this has been a very successful undertaking.
So there are no real birds left. They are all there for to monitor us.
Yeah, I mean, there's some dispute about that. I think the details of how many actual birds are left is still being debated. But the bulk of them are monitoring our daily lives for, to satisfy a broader agenda that, look, I'm not behind.
The fact that you're able to say that with no hemming and hawing so cogently and a completely straight face is really impressive. That is really impressive. And it really tied into one of the other questions that wasn't also a question in jest, which is, have you ever questioned the nature of your own reality? Which is a reference to Westworld, where they replaced the humans with robots and they're there to monitor. And so you really covered a lot of ground there.
Well, the Our Birds Real thing is I absolutely love it. I love those kinds of performance art, and that's exactly what it is. And I don't know if you've been following it. I've been following it quite closely, and I think the guy does a fantastic job because he does it with a straight face. I don't know if you've seen him been interviewed. He doesn't let up. He holds it, and there's been other terrific performance art endeavors like that. There's one called Celebrity Meat that I use in my class all the time, and it's the idea that you take a cell from a celebrity and then you use stem cell technology, right, to grow meat from that celebrity sample, and then you mix it in with other spices and whatnot, so you get a spicy Kanye West sausage or something like that, and it looks completely real, and the individual who's doing this again claims it's real. But I love it because it really forces these kinds of conversations.
Okay, I was not in on the joke. I didn't realize that was performance art and satire. I thought they were really people out there like flat earthers thinking that birds were not real.
Yeah, so the birds aren't real is a shtick that a guy, he's clearly doing it to highlight how absurd some of these conspiracy theories are. And the fact that we have to wonder whether it's performance art speaks to how successful his performance art is. I mean, how much more absurd is that conspiracy theory than Pizzagate? How much more absurd is that conspiracy theory than, we didn't go to the moon, and on and on and on. So I think it's a very clever strategy to really force us to think about the nature of conspiracy theories.
Well, he got me. Not because I didn't think birds, well, it did make me question whether there were some. Okay, so how did you go from being a health policy law professor to this misinformation crusader?
It really pretty quickly out of the academic gate, in which I finished graduate school, I jumped into doing very interdisciplinary science policy work. And so looking at what kind of information is used to inform health policy. And you know this, very quickly you realize often the science is less than ideal, and then you also start to recognize that there are a lot of cultural and social forces that are shaping the evidence that is used to inform health and science policy, whether you're talking about clinical practice guidelines, or whether you're talking about, say, stem cell policy, or whether you're talking about patent policy. Regardless, there are all these forces that shape the evidence that we use. And I'm right out of the gate. So we're talking 25, 30 years ago. This was my passion. And that kind of evolved into looking at more and more about the role of pop culture and how science is represented in the public sphere. And I've been so fortunate, Brad, to have these fantastic interdisciplinary teams around, because I do not have the methodological chops to do a lot of the stuff that I like to do. So I get, we have these fantastic teams that we put together to do this work. And so that was the evolution, that was the evolution. And then, over the last 10, 15 years, it really has become about misinformation and, bunk therapies and unproven therapies. And some of my work is often I've called a debunker and all that, but a lot of my research involves more classic biomedicine, like stem cell research, like genomic research, where I look at the hype that surrounds those technologies and how those technologies are represented in the public sphere and how that influences the decisions we make about those technologies. And so I'm still passionate about it. I still love it, and I'm still fascinated by it. And holy cow, Brad, I never would have guessed in a million years how, when I first started doing this research, it was like, Tim, that's kind of a fun area to do research. It was kind of fringy, and kind of like, holy cow, has it ever become a core issue? I mean, I really think battling misinformation has become one of the defining issues of our time.
So what do you think of the responsibility of the physician is, right? Like, because this is primarily a physician audience. And so we try to treat the patient in front of us, right? But like, we're also authority figures. So this is kind of a two-part question. What is our role and what is our responsibility to the public in pointing out disinformation, or rather just spreading information?
So I have some pretty strong opinions about this. I think that physicians play a very important role for a whole bunch of reasons. First of all, we know, yes, trust has eroded. Yes, there are a lot of, other forces out there that are shaping how the public thinks about healthcare providers, but they remain one of the most trusted voices. So how they deal with misinformation matters. So look, we know misinformation is killing people. We know it's killing people, and we know that healthcare providers, from primary care physicians to specialists, they can make a difference, right? They can make a difference in the clinical setting, and they can make a difference in the broader public sphere. We know that. There's a lot of research that talks about how effective their role can be in this area. And I also think they have both a moral responsibility to do something, whether you're talking about looking at through the lens of, ethics guidelines, their obligations as a professional, or even legal obligations in the context of standard of care and consent. So I think that their role is significant. And I also think there's that professional obligation. So the licensing bodies, right? I think they need to do more to make sure they monitor what their members are saying. And there's been this really fascinating discussion around a tension between freedom of expression and their obligations as physicians. And I think that unfortunately has been a very effective rhetorical trick used by those pushing misinformation to destabilize the efforts by the licensing boards to monitor their members, because clearly physicians have a legal obligation to the public that they have to uphold. I mean, this is why the licensing boards exist, right? This is why they exist, is to protect the public. And having an MD, and by the way, I'm surrounded by MDs in my life. My wife is an MD, my son is an MD, my sister-in-law is an MD, my brother-in-law is an MD. That is a privilege. that's a privilege, and with that privilege comes you know this so well, all your listeners know this so well, it's comes obligations, and one of those obligations is to ensure that you're not spreading misinformation that hurts not only your patients but hurts the public.
So what you're saying is with great power comes great responsibility.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay, so then, but what about the slippery slope argument, right? So if we're going after people for spreading what they believe to be is true and turns out that the governing body disagrees with because we think it's misinformation, how do we decide where the line is, where we're going to come down and take away your board certification or not allow you to practice medicine in this state anymore? So these governing bodies, how do they fight against the slippery slope argument?
Well, I think that's a great question, and I do think that we are going to have ongoing debates, and we should have these debates about what is misinformation, right? What is disinformation? What is misinformation? We need to have those discussions, but I think it's really important to highlight, at the top, that the individuals that have been sanctioned or even highlighted by the licensing boards are clearly pushing misinformation. So this has been another kind of rhetorical trick that has been used, the slippery slope argument, to, again, to make licensing boards hesitate and to make this about freedom of expression. Because, and they also, they've rolled out, phrases like "I'm being silenced" or it's a cancel culture, when in reality, very, 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 very few physicians have actually been sanctioned, have been silenced in any single way. And those that have, especially in Canada and in the United States, were clearly pushing misinformation. This isn't stuff on the margins. Like, people weren't debating when should you get your booster or how much immunity do you actually get from Omicron. Those aren't the kind of discussions that we're having here. This is stuff that was clearly misinformation about the efficacy of the vaccines, about things like ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine. This wasn't stuff on the margins. This was stuff that was clearly problematic. And so that debate, despite how it's risen sort of in the popular discourse around this topic, is a little bit of a red herring, because we're not there yet. We're really talking about trying to stop healthcare providers from spreading stuff that is clearly misinformation and that is clearly harmful. Having said that, I think your question off the top is important. How we define that, and however we do it, we should do it transparently, and we should do it in a way that all the players involved know what we're talking about and understand how we arrived at that conclusion. But the interesting thing is, there's standards of care. There's standards of care when you're talking about clinical care, and there can be standards of care when you're talking about communication. We make these decisions, these kinds of margins decisions, where is the line decisions all the time in healthcare. And this, I think, going forward is going to be just another area where we're always wrestling with where the line resides.
And I think one of the words that you used is misinformation that is harmful. I think that could be a line, right? Are you spreading misinformation that is clearly harmful to the public? So now you are a danger to the public. That seems like you'd be able to, for the most egregious people, you'd be able to draw that line pretty clearly.
I think so. And certainly for all the players that we've been talking about over the past, 2.5 years, right? I think that definition alone, it's scientifically inaccurate, falls outside the body of evidence and is clearly harmful. I think that would apply to all the players we're talking about now. But what is interesting, Brad, is I think that, because people will say, "Oh, what do you care if they offer homeopathy?" Or, "Tim, why do you care if they're doing Reiki?" Or, pushing magical thinking can be harmful too, right? Just tolerating pseudoscience. Now, whether it's really going to trigger a sanction is one thing, but I don't think we should tolerate it as a profession, as a scientific community. And we really have tolerated it, I think, for a really long time. And I think we've got to stop doing that, because we've seen what happens when we kind of embrace magical thinking.
Yeah, it seems like that would be a good way to maybe start a conversation with your patients too. And I like that phrase too, magical thinking, because it's a way to, it really highlights just how outlandish these things are, where people don't think of them. The public doesn't think of them that way, right? They don't think of Reiki as being magical. They think there's maybe some real stuff happening. But when you use that term, it really, I think, highlights to the patient just how far afield they've gone. Oh, yes. Okay. Sounds like you're practicing magic there. And although that
You're
might
right,
really
Brad.
damage the relationship.
Yeah, I think you're right, because I mean, if we use Reiki as example, think about what we're suggesting. We're suggesting there's a life force energy that runs through your body that has a measurable impact that you can control with your hands without touching, right? That's magic, right? That's magic. It wouldn't correspond to any sort of known scientific principles. And I think it's really important to highlight, Brad. I've been studying this area for decades, and there has been a shift. Because in the past, things like Reiki and some other kinds of modalities were often presented almost as a spiritual exercise, right? That it's sort of a philosophy almost of health. The shift a shift has occurred where now they're presented as if they're based on scientific principles, right? So it's quantum physics, or they talk about waveforms, or our bioenergy, and they use this terminology, and they do that to legitimize it because they want the best of both worlds. They want the credibility that comes with science, but they also want to have the looseness that comes with it being an alternative therapy, and don't hold me to those standards. You can't have it both ways. But the good news is, it's kind of made my job easier, because if you're really talking about a philosophy or a spiritual approach to health, that's almost a different question, right? Does that belong in our healthcare system? And
like
that's an
religion.
interesting question, right?
You don't want to question somebody's religion, right? You don't want to go there as a physician. But if you're saying if they're involving science, now we have an avenue to say that's not how quantum mechanics works. Actually,
Exactly right.
That's
So
not
you're
Brownian
using this
motion,
terminology. You're going to be held to the standard of science, and if we're going to use that standard, it doesn't pass.
Well, I just want to, for the listeners out there, for those who aren't watching on YouTube, I just want to highlight the fact that he was describing Reiki, and it really sounded like he was describing the Force while wearing an X-Wing fighter T-shirt. So, just for those that didn't have the visual,
I'm a hypocrite.
So some of these ideas out there, though, are being pushed by celebrities, which is a lot of what you do, a lot of what you cover and write and speak about. So why is it that people listen to this preposterously ridiculous health advice from a celebrity that is ultimately magical thinking, but not me?
It's a fascinating question, isn't it? And look, we have. I think it's fair to say we have a lot of evidence, and it's hard to study this well. A lot of the work I do, I'm always talking about we got to use the best available evidence, and a lot of the phenomenon I'm interested in, it's hard to study it well. It'll be observational research, correlation research. So with that big caveat, we have a pretty robust body of evidence that tells us that celebrity endorsements, celebrity commentary does have an impact. It really does have a measurable impact. And I'll give you a couple of examples in a moment. And it is an interesting question, because if we went out on the street and we interviewed 1,000 people and we asked them, do you trust celebrities? Almost everyone's going to say no, right? I bet all your patients, they would say no. But despite that, we know that they have an impact. So what's going on there? So I don't really think it's that they trust them. It's a couple things. One is that it's just the megaphone, right? I mean, the mere fact that they have this megaphone and they can put these ideas out into the ether, that matters, right? And a good example of that is the 5G COVID myth. This idea that 5G technology caused COVID. It was percolating in the conspiracy world for a while, and then when people like Woody Harrelson started talking about it, it took off. And MIA, the singer MIA, was another individual. People don't think that Woody Harrelson is a physicist, but he just was able to put it out there. And then the availability bias comes into play, because you can recall it more quickly because it came from Woody Harrelson. The other thing is I think the anecdote, the testimonial aspect of celebrity endorsements, or celebrity commentary. And the best example of that is someone like Tom Brady. I'm originally from New England, so I bleed Patriot blue. Go Pats. But he is 45 years old, and people say, how did he play so long? How come he's still so good? And he does these ridiculous exercises and eats this ridiculous diet, and he's held up as this beautiful anecdote. And we know there's good evidence that tells us that testimonials and anecdotes can be very persuasive, especially when they're a celebrity, someone you're going to remember. So it's a combination of the availability bias and then the power of anecdote and testimonials that holds sway. And then, of course, the other thing is just often they speak to your values, right? That you can relate to this individual. We saw that, I think, a little bit with Aaron Rodgers. He started talking, anti-vax rhetoric. And if you were anti-vax, all of a sudden you had this voice, this famous voice that was sort of echoing your beliefs. And then it takes on more power. But let me, if I can, Brad, I think this is a really important question. So I want to give you one really powerful example, and that's the Jolie effect. You must be familiar with the Jolie effect. So
I am not.
Angelina
Jolie.
Angelina
Jolie. Yes.
Yeah,
okay.
Angelina
Now I know
Jolie. Yeah, I think it was 2013 and 2015, writes 2 op-eds for the New York Times about her decision to get genetic testing and have a prophylactic mastectomy. They were thoughtful, Brad. They were thoughtful op-eds. They weren't sensationalistic, really just talking about her experience and her decision. As a result of those 2 op-eds, the number of genetic tests, for BRCA1 and BRCA2 goes up, and the number of prophylactic surgeries go up. We can have a really interesting discussion about whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, but that highlights how endorsement by a celebrity can have an impact on a pretty big decision, a pretty consequential decision, right? And there's many other examples, but that's, I think, a powerful one.
So you said the power of the anecdote, right? Is that something that we could then turn on its head to use to our advantage when we're talking to people about information versus misinformation? I mean, is that the type of thing we want to cover? Or if not, is there something else that misinformation, or a way in which misinformation spreads, that we can turn around to our advantage?
Yes to all the above.
Okay.
So I really do think that we need to use all of the tools that are used to spread misinformation in order to spread the good stuff, right? Creativity wins, I always like to say. And again, we have good evidence, or an emerging body of evidence to support that. But I think we really need to be careful here. In that we're not using fire to fight fire. What we're doing is using an anecdote, a story, a narrative, in order to get across the science, the body of evidence that is supportive of whatever point we want to make, whether it's vaccines work or wash your hands. Use an anecdote, use a story, use humor in order to get across that point. We absolutely, I think it's really important to do that. The other thing that we want to do is we want to make sure that we have shareable content that's easy to share on social media. One of my favorite examples of it was around the ivermectin debate. The FDA put out a tweet that said, "You're not a horse, you're not a cow, seriously, y'all, stop it." And this came from the FDA, right? And some people were critical of the FDA for doing that, saying it's a little bit glib, and should, a science-based institution like the FDA really be doing that? I think we have to. I like seeing entities like the FDA step into the social media universe in a way with content that is shareable. It's scientifically accurate, and it's shareable content. Not everyone liked it. Joe Rogan didn't like it, for example.
Right. It doesn't agree with it. That's like when you say celebrities shouldn't be talking about science. They shouldn't be talking about politics. But people only say that when they disagree with that particular celebrity. And there's actually precedent for that, for what the FDA did, because a few years ago, the CDC put out something about preparing for a zombie apocalypse. This is what you need to prepare for the zombie apocalypse. And it was basically what you need to prepare for any type of natural disaster. It was the same thing, right? Like, you want to make clean water supply and, a number of other things. So they were and that was when The Walking Dead was super big. So getting out there and using humor, it's their responsibility, I think. Like, there are all these other celebrities on social media that have people like, what's the sliced meat person on Steakum? The Steakum Twitter account is amazing. And he's like, he's got to be like a philosophy PhD or something, because super clever and all like on point to sell sliced meat. So if the government had someone like that to be able to spread information, I mean, that'd be so powerful.
I totally agree with you, and who would have ever guessed that that we'd have this science informed feed coming from this source, right? But uh, you're right, and I always say that what we need to do is use these pop culture moments as an opportunity to talk about the science, and I often try to do that. Like I'll use something that a celebrity said, or as an opportunity to talk about the real science. I do try to keep my content positive. Try not to. I try not to point the finger at consumers and people that are just looking for answers. But if you are a celebrity, if you're Aaron Rodgers, if you're Gwyneth Paltrow, if you're Tom Brady, I don't think you need to keep the gloves on, right? I mean, I think these people are making tens of millions of dollars based on their brand, and they're using their brand to sell bunk. So you can use these as sort of pop culture moments to talk about what the science actually says on a topic, and you can have fun with it. You can have, I think it's absolutely fair to have fun with it. I have a lot of colleagues that use a little bit of snark, right? I think you got to use that carefully. But if you're trying to create a little bit of momentum around an idea, I think it can be used well.
A while ago, I had Scott Dickers on the podcast, who was one of the founders of The Onion, and his rule for humor is meant to, oh man, it's escaping me now, but comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. So that applies exactly to what you said.
Sounds like my rule.
The celebrities are comfortable, so it's okay to afflict them. You just need to comfort the afflicted, and you can afflict the comfortable, and you'll be in a safe place as long as you look at that before you go, making fun of someone's actions or beliefs.
Yeah, I agree. Just today, I was making fun of Aaron Rodgers. That's why he's top of mind for me, because I don't know if you saw the headline. He was taking psychedelics in order to get more focus, and that's why he got the MVP. And he talked about how he merged with the ocean and all this kind of stuff.
Oh yeah, it was the ayahuasca. Yeah, definitely.
That's exactly right. And some of his followers, how dare you make fun of someone who's struggling with mental health issues and he's looking for answers. Look, Aaron Rodgers, that he is. What does he make? Hundreds of millions of dollars, and that's not what the point is here. And so, yeah, if do it carefully, I think it can really help the public discourse.
So, what about when we're talking to our patients about information versus misinformation? Right? They've got this idea that they read about, and it seems so appealing to them, right? What I say is candy is always going to be more appealing than broccoli. And it seems like they've got a Snickers in their hand and we've got broccoli, and we have to convince them that they should be eating more broccoli, which is in fact the case. We are trying every day to get our patients to eat more actual broccoli, but in a larger context, how do we fight that fight? It just seems like such a, and I'm going to have a lot of trouble saying this word, Sisyphean feat to overcome that on an individual basis and in the public sphere.
It really feels that way, and when I give public lectures on this, I always hear people say, "Is there any point to even fighting this? Because it seems futile. It just seems, like the holding back the tide kind of vibe." And I always try to. I'm an optimist. I really think that we can make a difference. Certainly on the physician-patient level, you can make a difference. I absolutely, I think that's the case. But also on a social level, there's a growing body of evidence that tells us that battling bunk works, like that you really can make a difference. And I think it doesn't feel like it because there just is so much misinformation out there. But think about what it would be like if we didn't fight the misinformation. It'd be even worse, right? It would be even worse. So I think we need to recognize that. And the other thing I think it's important to note is there are examples of success, and I'm going to use my own country of Canada. The numbers are echoed in the United States, unfortunately not as strongly, but the trend is there. In the halfway through the pandemic, about half of Canada was skeptical of vaccines. the vaccines hadn't arrived yet. But you were looking at a hesitancy rate, 45%, 50%, depending on what survey that you looked at. As soon as they come out, it improves. But now we're looking at in Canada, over 90% of our country has got at least one vaccine, and the hardcore deniers are they're there and they're loud and they're still making a difference. I think they're having, unfortunately, an impact on the booster uptake. But we saw this uptake and this change, and I think that's often forgotten. The same thing happened with masks. Everyone talks about the mask debate, but you deal with patients. We went from zero mask wearing to 2 years later in Canada, it was like almost 90%, it was over 80%. That behavior change like that almost never happens, right? And so I think we have to remember that was because of good science communication. That was because of good debunking. That was a big part of the story. And we also have empirical evidence that tells us that, getting on social media, countering the misinformation really can make a difference. So yeah, get out there and fight the good fight.
Is there any misinformation out there that you've heard perpetuated by physicians? Not like fringe physicians, like, the Great Barrington Declaration, right? But maybe either your own personal physician or one of your family members. Have they ever said anything to you that you knew to be misinformation? And how did you react?
Wow, that's a great question. So, yeah, the answer is yes, and hopefully they're not going to listen. I won't use any names. I bet you've heard this too from colleagues. Supplements around things like vitamin D, and look, yeah, certainly there was interesting research going on based on observational studies that really didn't pan out in clinical trials around vitamin D. But I heard, I definitely heard some people talk about it in very definitive language. And I think that's often the difference, right? It's not, well, there's interesting research going on here. It's doubtful, it's harmful, uncertain whether it'll be beneficial. That's not the kind of language that you were hearing. You're hearing that this is one of the things that you need to do to battle. And that's misinformation. And one of the reasons that goes back to that magical thinking problem. One of the reasons I also don't like that is it also helps the alternative medicine industry, right? Because now all of a sudden supplements broadly, the broad umbrella of supplements now seems more legit, more plausible, because we were kind of endorsing this one in a not very scientifically robust way. So I heard that one a lot. I don't know if you heard that. And then I also heard, some of the mask misinformation, emanating from colleagues. And I think part of it is we're all to blame in how we talk about scientific uncertainty. I think we have to get better at that, because I'm not saying a lot of these things can't be discussed, but I think we have to do a better job reflecting the scientific uncertainty and the nature of that scientific evolution, right? That we know is going to happen. It's always going to happen. And I think that we all did we've gotten better, I think, but we, especially early days, didn't do a great job talking about that science or respecting that scientific uncertainty in the public sphere.
I think that scientific uncertainty is some of the problem, because when you're talking about someone spreading misinformation, they're saying it with such great conviction, right? It's definitely going to help. You're going to feel better. You're going to lose that weight. You're going to look better. You're going to look younger. You're going to. When you see me, Dr. Block, are these antibiotics going to make my sinus infection go away? Is this surgery going to work? Well, how do you define work? This is what the surgery might do. This is what it might not do. This is like, most people feel this way, but I can't guarantee anything. How am I, the way I sell something, which is I'm clearly not selling, I'm advising, versus, the supplement industry, as an example, they say things with such great invention.
Yeah.
Whereas us, we have to talk about uncertainty. So how do we fight that fight, right? So on top of broccoli versus candy, it's certainty versus uncertainty. So how do we sell information coming from the land of uncertainty?
Ever the optimist, I think we can do it. I think we can do it. And I think how some people talked about ivermectin is a really good example of that. You had these fringe doctors saying ivermectin work, it's a miracle drug, it cures all these things, very definitive language. And then some of the more thoughtful ones pushing against it, they were almost too careful. they would say, well, we don't have good evidence about whether it works or it doesn't work. The evidence base is very uncertain. I think that we can reflect that scientific uncertainty in a way that is still, you can still engage with it, right? You can say, look, the body of evidence that we have right now suggests that it doesn't work. And that's not twisting the evidence. That's where the evidence takes us. And I think we need to be a little bit more, I lean hard on that concept of the body of evidence, because I think it actually can do a lot of work, especially when you're talking about, complex phenomenon. And I think we need leaning on those kinds of concepts. I think we can have language that is more actionable than we have in the past, and still respect the scientific uncertainty.
Okay. So maybe that even gets us more credibility.
Yeah, I think it can. And look, not every MD, not every researcher wants to be out in the public sphere, but I think that one of the good news stories of the pandemic is we have seen more and more clinicians, researchers, scientists get on TikTok and on Instagram and on Twitter and in your local news and writing op-eds, and they've been unreal, right? There's seen some really entertaining TikTok clinicians, and I don't think
still
it's
not there.
I'm not there.
It was a leap to get on Instagram. Like my wife had to help me get on my help me get on Twitter. I get right. Words, we're saying things to each other. Instagram was a leap. Now I have to like do a dance and point at boxes. Like, man, I just can't. I can't.
I'm with you. I can't. And I think there's almost like an age limit on TikTok, isn't there? Like, I think I'm not. It probably won't even open up for me.
I'm Gen X. I think it won't take my thumbprint. Yeah. So how do we immunize ourselves against misinformation? And for me, my question really is for me, because this podcast is really all about me and the questions I have for people. Like, as I'm inviting people on to be a guest, how do I make sure that I'm not giving a platform to some fringe thinker, right? Because they might have some ideas, and that's the whole idea with misinformation. There's like elements of truthiness to it, but it's just not true. So how do I, and actually to go back to another Star Wars reference, right? Yoda and Luke, how do I know the good side from the bad?
It's a great question, and it's actually, I think, a really complex one because, believe it or not, I'm not a big fan of the idea of totally deplatforming. I think that should be like a tool of last resort. So there are going to be situations where you're going to have people on that maybe have fringe views, but the key is to hold their feet to the fire, and because Joe Rogan, for example, defended himself saying, oh, there are all these different views. I'm just asking questions, jacking off, right? Just asking questions. That's not what he was doing, right?
Yeah, that's what Tucker Carlson says too. So he's in great company there.
And he's cheerleading. They're cheerleading these ideas, right? That is very, very, very different than bringing, Peter McCullough on and saying, look, here's the body of evidence on this topic. The study that you're referring to has been retracted. It's a single study. It was done poorly. You don't have any of that, right? It's just this cheerleading going on. So I think you can talk about fringe views in a way that isn't going to necessarily legitimize those views and sort of feed false balance. And I think that's what is always the danger. So you always want to use a weight of evidence approach, right? A weight of evidence approach. And there's, again, evidence even in the context of vaccine hesitancy that, being exposed to false balance really does harm. And being exposed to a commentary that is built on the weight of evidence can be very constructive. And so I think that's what you want to do. You want to lean on that sort of weight of evidence approach, whether you're talking about having this individual on or whether you're talking about selecting a guest or even just talking about a topic. And I think that's the approach that more journalists need to adopt also.
Yeah. Rather than just, I'm going to let both sides have their day. Okay, but in numbers, like you said, weighted evidence. That means we're going to have one climate denier and 1,100 scientists talking about, and so they'll get, comparable to the weight of the evidence.
We actually did a study on false balance in the context of the Great Barrington Declaration. We published it earlier this year, and it was pretty bad in the the popular press in general, the sort of the mainstream media, the legacy media, were actually pretty good in the context of COVID. We've been studying this for throughout the entire pandemic. Not ideal, lots of examples of problems, but in general, right, it was pretty solid. And by the way, there's a correlation between getting your information from the legacy media and not believing misinformation, and getting your information from alternate sources and believing misinformation. So you have a lot of different ways you can look at that question. But we definitely found false balance in the context of this, natural herd immunity approach to dealing with the pandemic. And in that piece, we speculated that did have an impact on both policy and public perceptions of the evidence-based public health measures that were being deployed to fight the pandemic.
Oh yeah, I heard from so many people that like, okay, this is it. We're almost there. We're almost there. Herd immunity. Even though in the history of mankind, we've never gotten herd immunity to anything except through immunization. So you said deplatforming. There's someone out there that really needs to be deplatformed, I think, who's currently running for Senate. So I don't think he has a show anymore. But let's say, hypothetical situation. If you were invited, would you have gone on the Dr. Oz show?
So it's a great question, and I have thought about it. It's tough. It's one of those on the one hand and on the other hand. So on the one hand, it's an audience that you want to speak to. It's an audience that you want to have the opportunity to express a science-informed opinion on a topic. So if he, let's say, he's endorsed homeopathy, and could you go on and actually debunk homeopathy? On the other hand, are you legitimizing him? Are you legitimizing the other messages that he puts forward? Are you kind of giving him a pass on all the harm that he's done in the past? And in the aggregate, I lean to that. I think that it'd be hard. I thought about this in the context of Joe Rogan, for example, but with Dr. Oz in particular, I think he's done so much harm and continues to do harm. I think the answer would probably be no. But it's not always an easy, it's not always a straightforward answer. Let me give you one example from the past. I recently wrote a series of articles for Men's Health magazine on misinformation. And I was very proud of those articles, by the way, and the editors were amazing. They really were. The way they fact checked it and the way they edited it. But I did have some colleagues say, that publication isn't always evidence-based. Think about what the diets they've pushed and the exercise they've. But what an important audience to reach, right? So, where you have this male audience that perhaps has a very particular point of view, and I think it's a real opportunity. So, yeah, I think you've got to weigh those questions, and that weighing is getting more and more complicated all the time.
And to me, that's a sign of a good person who's doing the right thing, right? You're grappling with it. Like, is this the right thing? And again, it's like the uncertainty. If you're dealing with uncertainty, you're probably on the right path. If you're dealing with certainty, you're probably not. And so if you're not sure, and you're, that to me is the sign of a healthy relationship with what you're doing, because it's often not clear. It's often not clear. And you had mentioned like a magazine like that, right? It also, it's for profit. Like those the legacy media, they thrive on advertising, right? And so they're going to need to cover these topics that are going to get more clicks and more people that are viewing their stuff, because they need to stay in business. So it's this conflict between covering things that are important and covering things that are popular. And they kind of have to do both. Otherwise, you're just going to have trash out there only covering what's popular because everybody else is underwater. Which brings us to the next question that I was hoping to ask. And that's the difference between conflict of interest and conspiracy. right? Because the legacy media, clearly there's a conflict of interest because they're not publicly funded. They're privately funded. So they have to appease their advertisers. So there's a conflict of interest, but that's not the same as conspiracy.
It's not, but I think it's important to recognize that, and this is why, talking about conspiracies and misinformation can often get complicated. Watergate was a conspiracy. That really was a conspiracy. And so you have these real conspiracies that played out, and people point to them. But the reality is, they generally are uncovered and they're relatively rare. Another example, of course, is Big Pharma. Big Pharma, they have been bad actors in the past, right? So if you're suspicious of vaccines and you say, well, look what they did with Vioxx, or look what, they have been bad actors in the past. And we always have to remember that. In fact, we at our institute, we actually do research on the role of academics working with industry and the impact that has on public trust and the impact that has on the nature of the scientific inquiry. And it's generally bad. It's generally bad. If industry is involved, the public trusts the research less. Literally they know that, research is throughout the biomedical infrastructure. But so these are really important questions. And I think, transparency is obviously one of the things that is absolutely essential. But the other thing I think is essential in the vaccine debate is a good example of this, is to highlight, again, I'm going to use this phrase, the body of evidence that is out there, right? Just because industry did it, yes, we should recognize that industry did the research. We should recognize the fact that could have an impact on the way the research was undertaken and the outcome. But look, there was also this study that was funded by the public, by a public entity, without any industry funding, same conclusion. We should weigh all of those factors when we're looking at the body of evidence. And good entities like the Cochrane collaboration, they do that, right? They try to consider the conflicts of interest that are relevant to the conclusions that are out there. And I think we need to do more. We need to do more of that. The last thing I say, I'm going on too long on this point, Brad, but it's a really important point. That's I think something else that I hope is a legacy of the pandemic, is a greater appreciation of how important trustworthy science is, right? This science that the public can really trust. And we need to create incentive structures and funding structures and also the ability for the public to see how the science happens so they can trust it. I think we need more and more of that.
So we're going to be wrapping up soon, and this is a bit of a non sequitur, but I just have to ask it before we wrap up, because you met with Gwyneth's doctor, right? I don't think we need to refer to her last name because everyone knows who Gwyneth is, right? You met Gwyneth's doctor. First, how did, knowing who you are and what you do, this physician agree to that meeting? And two, what was that like?
It was really funny. I was surprised he agreed to meet with me. And it's a funny story because I met him in Hollywood. It was like, it played out exactly like you would probably imagine if you were like doing a script. It played out exactly like you thought it would play out. I met his office manager first, and I won't use any names. And I went to this beautiful
a lot
office.
Of mahogany, big windows. Yeah,
exactly right.
Picture,
and I think he offered me a smoothie, and and while we're talking, he's telling me that I have adrenal fatigue and I need to go on this cleanse in order to reset my system.
Did he see you as a patient?
He's giving me advice. I think
you can see that from the look, from your youthful glow, that you have adrenal fatigue. Well, that's nice.
Which isn't a thing, as everyone probably knows.
It's so nice to meet you. You have adrenal fatigue.
So, and I actually did do the cleanse, by the way, which I had no coffee for 3 weeks. It almost killed me. But what was really funny was, as I'm talking to him and as he's going on about all of his theories, I could see his office manager fellow Googling me. Right. And I could see the expression change. And once they realized who I am, I'm ushered out and the interview is abruptly started. I actually talk about this in one of my books, so it's not a big secret. But it was interesting to see, right? This is an individual who's trying to build a brand. He's trying to create a narrative that is attractive to individuals. And that's what the whole, became apparent to me very quickly that that's what was going on.
And they, I'm sure, believe everything that they say. I don't think no, you don't think so?
So I go back and forth on that, Brad. Like, I think that's a very interesting question. You know, the short answer is I think they probably do believe it, you know, so they can sleep at night. You know, there's a little bit of cognitive dissonance going on, you know. But with someone like Gwyneth, I kind of go back and forth. Is it, you know, just cynical profit making? I think it's a complex mixture of all the above.
Or Dr. Oz's hopium, right? I want to give people like something to start them on the right path. And actually my wife, who gives me permission to talk about her on the podcast, she, knowing how I feel about all this stuff, I see on our garbage area, which is where, you know, when you walk in the door, you put everything on there, is a goop cleanse. I'm like, oh, first of all, you know,
I've done it.
And second, yeah. And you look great. You look great. It must have gotten rid of that adrenal fatigue.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So it was just, like,
you know, the funny thing is I lost a whole bunch of weight, you know, and so you attribute that to the cleanse, and then of course immediately all came back on, like as soon as I stopped, right? So that's my fault, Brad. I didn't have the strength, right? So the cleanse worked, and then my fragile constitution failed. So and on the circle goes.
But that, you bring up an excellent point. And actually we've talked about this, the type of thing on previous podcasts. So if you do have a patient who experiences, you know, they went on a cleanse and now they're all discouraged, I think it's important to highlight the fact that they're thinking this. They're thinking, I'm a failure. There's something wrong with me. I don't have the strength. How come everyone else can do it and I can't? And you have to bring that up with them and highlight to them how incorrect that way of thinking is, and you know, try and get them somehow to put a positive spin on things. And I think that's where we as individual physicians in these places, you know, earn their trust, and you can get them on a better, healthier path where they're not wasting their money on goop, which is just expensive goop, appropriately named.
Absolutely.
So where can people find you online?
I'm on Twitter, Caulfield Tim. I'm on Instagram, Caulfield Tim, and you can, you know, Google and find some of the stuff I've written about. And I'd love to hear people's comments on all the things that we've talked about, Brad.
Well, I've been really looking forward to this for a long time, and you did not disappoint. Such a great interview, and thank you for all the important work that you do. I really appreciate it. The listeners appreciate it, and thank you.
Thanks very much. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to this incredibly important audience. And I'll end with my two favorite words: go science.
#Go Science.
That was Dr. Bradley Block at the Physician's Guide to Doctoring. He can be found at physiciansguidetodoctoring.com or wherever you get your podcasts. If you have a question for a previous guest or have an idea for a future episode, send a comment on the webpage. Also, please be sure to leave a 5-star review on your preferred podcast platform. We'll see you next time on the Physician's Guide to Doctoring.